Before we start, leave a like and subscribe to the channel." She cried quietly, not from shame that she had lost long ago, but from exhaustion. Exhaustion from existing without being seen. The plastic cup had been empty for hours. The most recent coin had been tossed like someone throwing breadcrumbs to a pigeon. Nobody asked her name. Nobody asked anything at all. Marina pressed her back against the rough brick wall, feeling the cold seep through the layers of worn fabric that used to be a coat. Around her, the city moved with mechanical indifference. Footsteps accelerated as people approached her corner. Eyes looked everywhere except at her face. She had become an obstacle to navigate around, a discomfort to avoid, a problem that wasn't theirs to solve. The evening light cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and she watched them stretch and fade, marking another day survived but not lived. Her fingers were numb despite the relatively mild temperature. Hunger had become such a constant companion that she barely noticed it anymore. It was the loneliness that gnawed at her with sharper teeth. A woman in an expensive business suit approached, absorbed in her phone. Marina didn't even bother to look up, didn't extend her cup with the hopeful gesture she'd tried in the early days. She knew what would come next. The woman glanced up at the last second, saw Marina, and abruptly crossed the street mid-block, nearly stepping into traffic in her urgency to avoid passing too close. Marina felt the familiar sting, not fresh pain, but the dull throb of a wound reopened. How many times, she wondered, how many times can you be treated as invisible before you start to believe you are? A group of young professionals left a nearby restaurant, laughter spilling out into the street with them. One of them spotted her and made a comment that carried on the wind. "That's what happens when you make bad choices." The others laughed, their judgment delivered casually, as if her entire existence could be summarized and dismissed in a single thoughtless sentence. She wiped her face with the dirty sleeve of her coat, leaving a smear across her cheek. The tears weren't about the cruelty anymore. She'd developed calluses against that. The tears were about something deeper, something that hurt more than hunger or cold, or even the casual cruelty of strangers. The tears were about erasure, about being reduced from a person to scenery, about shouting into a void that never echoed back. The worst thing about poverty isn't the hunger, she thought, staring at the indifferent crowd streaming past. It's becoming landscape. It's disappearing while you're still alive. She'd been on this corner for 7 months now. 7 months since the apartment was lost. 7 months since the last shreds of her former life had finally slipped away. In that time, she'd learned that rock bottom wasn't a moment. It was a state of being, a place you could sink into deeper and deeper, discovering that there were always lower depths to fall. The traffic light at the intersection changed, casting red, then green, then amber light across her face. She barely noticed. Her mind had retreated to that dangerous place it went sometimes, the place where she reviewed every decision, every moment, trying to find where exactly her life had veered off course, trying to pinpoint the precise instant when she'd stopped being human in other people's eyes. "I had a name once," she reminded herself, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. "I had work. I had dignity. I had a future." But those memories felt increasingly distant, like photographs left too long in sunlight, their details fading until you could barely make out the faces. Sometimes she wondered if she'd imagined her entire life before this corner. If maybe she'd always been here, always been invisible, and everything else was just a pleasant dream she'd once had. The evening crowd thinned as rush hour ended. Soon the street would belong to a different population. The late shift workers, the restaurant staff heading home, the people who moved through the city after dark. She'd be here for all of it, the same as every night, watching the world that refused to watch her back. She was about to shift position, trying to find a spot where the wall didn't press quite so hard against her spine, when she heard it. The sound cut through the usual urban symphony of voices and footsteps and distant traffic, the deep, refined rumble of an expensive engine. Marina didn't look up. Fancy cars passed this corner all the time. They were just another reminder of the vast chasm between her world and the world of people who mattered. But this time was different. The engine sound didn't fade into the distance. Instead, it slowed, then stopped completely. The sudden silence felt almost unnatural in the constant flow of traffic. Against her better judgment, against the protective instinct that told her to keep her eyes down and avoid attention, Marina looked up. A sleek, black sedan sat at the curb, directly in front of her, its polished surface reflecting the streetlights like dark water. The kind of car that cost more than most people earned in a year. The kind of car that never stopped in this neighborhood unless someone was lost or looking for directions. But the driver didn't seem lost. The car sat there, engine idling softly, as if whoever was inside had stopped deliberately, intentionally. Marina's heart began to beat faster. Experience had taught her that attention from strangers was rarely a good thing. Sometimes people stopped to mock her, sometimes to film her for their social media. Once, someone had pretended to offer help just to humiliate her in front of their friends. She started to lower her eyes again, to resume her practiced invisibility, when the driver's door opened. He didn't emerge in a hurry. No dramatic exit, no theatrical gesture. He simply stood from the car with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being in control of any situation. Everything about him spoke of success. The perfectly tailored suit that fit like it had been made specifically for his frame. The posture that conveyed authority without arrogance. The way he moved with purposeful certainty. But it was his face that held Marina's attention. There was no disgust there, no pity, no uncomfortable avoidance. He was looking directly at her, seeing her. And his expression was something she hadn't encountered in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Respect. The street seemed to pause. Other pedestrians slowed their pace, curious about this unusual scene. A homeless woman and a man who clearly belonged to a different world, connected by nothing except his deliberate choice to stop. He approached slowly, as if giving her time to process, to decide whether to engage or retreat. When he spoke, his voice was measured, thoughtful, carrying a weight that suggested every word was chosen with intention. "You're crying from hunger, or from something worse." The question hit Marina like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate. Because somehow this stranger had looked at her and seen past the obvious surface to the deeper pain underneath. She laughed, a harsh, broken sound without humor. "You won't like the answer, sir." She expected him to nod politely and leave, his moment of charitable curiosity satisfied. That's what people did when they accidentally glimpsed the real depths of suffering. They retreated quickly, uncomfortable with having looked too closely. Instead, he extended his hand, not holding money, not dropping coins into her cup, extending his hand to her, as if she were a person, as if touching her wouldn't contaminate him. "Come, let's eat." Marina stared at his hand, her mind racing. This had to be a joke, some elaborate setup for humiliation. Or maybe he was dangerous, using kindness as a lure. Every survival instinct she developed on the streets screamed warnings. But there was something in his eyes that quieted those alarms. A straightforwardness, an absence of the predatory gleam she'd learned to recognize. She hesitated, aware that the entire street was watching now. Some people had their phones out, recording this unusual interaction. A few were muttering to each other, their expressions ranging from confusion to judgment. She could read their thoughts in their faces. What is he doing? Why would someone like that stop for someone like her? The man remained patient, his hand still extended, his expression unchanged, waiting for her decision without pressure or impatience. Marina's hand trembled as she reached out. Her fingers were dirty, nails broken and grimy. His palm was clean, warm, steady. The contrast felt obscene. She almost pulled back, suddenly mortified by the physical evidence of how far she'd fallen. But he closed his hand around hers with firm, uncomplicated respect and helped her to her feet. Her legs wobbled after hours of sitting. He steadied her without comment, without drawing attention to her weakness. Then he gestured toward the car. The interior was immaculate. Leather seats that looked like they'd never been sat on. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with that new car smell. Marina hesitated at the door, suddenly aware of how she must look, how she must smell. the dirt and degradation she'd carry into this pristine space. "It's fine," he said, reading her hesitation. "Please." She slid into the passenger seat, feeling like an intruder in a foreign land. The door closed with a soft, expensive click that seemed to seal her off from the world she'd been inhabiting. Through the window, she could see people still watching, their expressions a mix of disbelief, judgment, and barely concealed hostility. The silence inside the car was profound. Not uncomfortable, not heavy with expectation or judgment, just safe. She couldn't remember the last time she'd experienced silence that felt safe. He started the engine and pulled smoothly into traffic, navigating the city streets with practiced ease. Marina sat rigid in her seat, her hands folded carefully in her lap to avoid touching anything more than necessary. "What's your name?" he asked after a few minutes. The question was so simple, so normal, that Marina felt tears spring to her eyes again. When was the last time someone had asked her name? When had she last been addressed as a person with an identity beyond "hey" or "you there," or more commonly, not addressed at all? "Marina," she whispered. "I'm Richard," he replied. "It's good to meet you, Marina. Good to meet you." As if this were a normal introduction. As if she were a colleague or acquaintance, not someone he'd just pulled off a street corner. They drove through parts of the city Marina recognized, but felt she no longer belonged in. The clean, bright districts where people lived normal lives, where they worried about normal things, where homelessness was something that happened to other people in other places. Richard pulled up to a restaurant that Marina recognized from her previous life. Not ostentatious, but quietly expensive. The kind of place where business deals were closed over exceptional food, where the staff were trained to be invisible until needed, where everyone who walked through the door belonged. Everyone except her. "I can't go in there," Marina said, her voice rough with panic. "Look at me. They won't—" "Yes, they will," Richard interrupted gently. "You're with me." He came around to open her door. Another small gesture of respect that landed like a blow, and walked beside her toward the entrance. Marina was acutely aware of every eye that turned their way, every flicker of recognition followed by confusion, the whispers that followed in their wake. The host's welcoming expression faltered when he saw Marina, his professional smile becoming strained. His eyes flickered between her and Richard, trying to process this unexpected situation. "Mr. Hastings," the host said carefully. "Your usual table?" "Yes, thank you, James." They were led through the restaurant, Marina feeling like a grotesque interruption in the carefully curated atmosphere. But Richard walked calmly beside her, his presence a shield against the stares and whispers. If he noticed the discomfort they were causing, he gave no sign. Their table was in a quiet corner, offering some privacy. Richard held her chair. Another gesture she'd almost forgotten existed. When she was seated, he took his own seat across from her and immediately handed her a menu. "Order whatever you'd like," he said. "Whatever sounds good." Marina looked at the menu, the words blurring through her tears. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen this much food, this many choices. The prices, even without looking directly at them, represented more money than she'd seen in months. "I don't—" she started, then stopped, not sure how to continue. "Take your time," Richard said. "There's no rush." When the waiter arrived, Marina ordered carefully, trying to choose things that wouldn't be too expensive, too elaborate. Richard ordered simply as well, then added, "And water, please, with ice and lemon." That small detail, cold water with lemon, such a simple luxury, nearly undid her completely. The food arrived quickly. Marina tried to eat slowly, tried to maintain some dignity, but her body had other ideas. She was halfway through her meal before she realized Richard had barely touched his own food. He was watching her, not with pity or disgust, but with that same focused attention he'd shown on the street. "I'm sorry," Marina said, setting down her fork, suddenly embarrassed. "I'm eating like—" "You're eating like someone who's hungry," Richard interrupted. "Please, continue. That's why we're here." Marina forced herself to slow down, to reclaim some control. Between bites, she drank the cold water, savoring the way it felt going down her throat, the slight tartness of the lemon, the ice clicking against the glass. Such small things, such profound pleasures. "May I ask you something?" Richard said when she'd finished most of her meal. Marina nodded, wariness creeping back. "On the street, you said I wouldn't like your answer, about whether you were crying from hunger or something worse." He leaned forward slightly. "I'd like to hear that answer now, if you're willing to share it." Marina set down her glass carefully, buying herself time. She could deflect, could offer some sanitized version that would be easier for both of them. But something in his steady gaze, in the respect he'd shown her from the moment he'd stopped, demanded honesty. "Something worse," she said finally. "Much worse. Tell me." So she did. Not all at once, not in neat chronological order, but in the fragmented, emotional way that truth often emerges. She told him about the invisibility, about becoming landscape, about the casual cruelty of people who saw her suffering as evidence of personal failure, rather than circumstance. She told him about the group that had laughed at her tonight, about the woman who'd crossed the street to avoid her, about the 1,000 tiny erasures that happened every single day. "The hunger is terrible," Marina said, her voice breaking. "But you can get used to hunger. Your body adjusts, finds ways to survive. But you can't adjust to being treated like you don't exist, like you're not human. That's what kills you, slowly, from the inside out. Not the lack of food, but the lack of recognition. The lack of basic human acknowledgement." Richard listened without interrupting, his expression grave. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said finally. "I didn't like that answer. But not because it made me uncomfortable. Because it's true, and I recognize it, and I'm implicated in it." "You?" Marina said, confused. "You stopped. You're here. I stopped in today," Richard said. "How many times have I walked past someone like you and done nothing? How many times have I been too busy, too focused on my own concerns, too comfortable with my explanations about why their suffering wasn't my responsibility?" He shook his head. "I don't know what made me stop today, but I do know that I should have stopped long before now." The waiter appeared to clear their plates. Richard ordered coffee and asked Marina if she wanted anything else. She requested hot tea, suddenly craving warmth. When they were alone again, Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her with that same focused attention. "Marina," he said carefully, "what I'm about to offer? You're free to refuse. No strings, no expectations, no obligation. Do you understand?" She nodded, her heart beginning to race again. "I'd like to help you get off the streets. Not temporarily, permanently. Housing, yes, but more than that. A real chance to rebuild, if you're willing." Marina's first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from disappointment, from the possibility that this was too good to be true, from the vulnerability of accepting help. But something stopped her. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just that for the first time in so long, someone was offering her a chance to be human again. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" Richard considered the question seriously. "Partly because it's the right thing to do. Partly because I suspect your story is more complicated than it appears, and everyone deserves a chance to tell their full story. But mostly," he met her eyes directly, "because I see you, Marina. I actually see you. And what I see is someone who's been failed by a system that should have protected her. Someone who deserves better than what she's received." Marina felt tears streaming down her face again. But these were different from the tears on the street corner. These were tears of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Possibility. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll accept your help." The apartment Richard arranged wasn't ostentatious, but to Marina it might as well have been a palace. A studio in a decent neighborhood, clean and safe, with a bed that didn't smell like the street, a bathroom with hot water, and a kitchen where she could prepare real food. The first night, she stood in the shower until the water ran cold, watching months of grime and degradation swirl down the drain. She scrubbed her skin until it hurt, trying to remove not just the physical dirt, but the psychological residue of invisibility. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a clean towel, and caught sight of herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the reflection. The face was gaunt, aged beyond her years, marked by experiences that had carved themselves into her features. But the eyes looked alive again. Richard had arranged for clothes to be delivered. Simple, practical things, nothing extravagant. He'd also left information about job placement services, counseling resources, and his personal number with a note. No pressure. Take the time you need. When you're ready, call. For the first 3 days, Marina did little but sleep. Real sleep. In a real bed. Without fear of theft or violence or being moved along by police. Her body seemed to be trying to recover months of missed rest all at once. On the 4th day, she ventured out to the grocery store. The experience was overwhelming. So many choices, so much abundance. The simple act of filling a cart with food she'd selected herself. At the checkout, when she handed over the debit card Richard had provided, loaded with enough money to get her started, the cashier treated her like any other customer. No judgment, no curiosity, just normal, mundane interaction. Marina nearly wept with gratitude for that normalcy. She began to establish routines. Morning walks around the neighborhood. Afternoons spent reading books from the local library. Evenings cooking simple meals in her tiny kitchen. Each small act of normal life felt like a victory. But she didn't call Richard. Not yet. Instead, she observed, she paid attention to everything around her, with an intensity born from months of enforced observation on the streets. She watched how systems worked, how people interacted, how the city functioned when you weren't being pushed to its margins. She also did research. Long hours at the library computer, following threads of information, piecing together a puzzle she'd begun to sense during that first dinner with Richard. When she finally called him, 3 weeks had passed. "Marina," Richard said, answering immediately. "How are you?" "Better," she said. "Much better, thanks to you. I'd like to meet if you have time. There's something I need to tell you." They met at the same restaurant, though this time Marina arrived clean, dressed appropriately, able to walk through the door without causing a disruption. The host recognized her and didn't bat an eye, either because Richard had prepared him or because the difference in her appearance was so dramatic. Richard stood when she approached the table, greeting her with genuine warmth. "You look well," he said. "I feel human again," Marina replied, which is both wonderful and terrifying. Over coffee, she updated him on her progress. The counseling session she'd started attending. The job application she'd begun submitting. The slow, tentative process of rebuilding a life. "I'm grateful," she said. "More grateful than I can express. You saved my life, Richard. Literally saved it." "I'm glad I could help," he said. "But you're doing the hard work of rebuilding. That's all you." Marina took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something. About who I was before the streets. About why I ended up there." Richard leaned forward, his expression attentive. "I was a manager," Marina began. "Middle management at a tech company. Nothing glamorous, but good work, good salary, good benefits. I had a team of 12 people reporting to me, and we did quality control for software deployments." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "There was a problem. A serious problem. We discovered that one of the senior executives had been falsifying safety reports on a product we were preparing to launch. Lives were potentially at stake. This was security software for hospitals. But this executive had investors breathing down his neck, and he'd promised a launch date that couldn't be met with proper testing." Richard's expression had gone very still. "I reported it," Marina continued. "Followed every proper channel. Documented everything. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting the company from liability, and protecting potential users from harm. What happened?" Richard asked quietly. "I was fired. Not directly for the whistleblowing, they were too smart for that. They created a paper trail of performance issues, claimed I'd been insubordinate, missed deadlines, created interpersonal conflicts with colleagues. All false, but carefully constructed and presented by the legal department." She met his eyes directly. "The executive I reported? He was protected. The product launched on schedule, with the flaws I'd identified still present. And I was destroyed professionally. Blacklisted in the industry through careful word of mouth. Unable to get references. Labeled as difficult to work with. Within 6 months, I couldn't find work. Within a year, I'd lost my apartment. Within 18 months, I was on that street corner where you found me. Richard's face had gone pale. Marina. What was the name of the company? She told him. She watched understanding dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by horror. That's my company, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I own that company. It's part of my portfolio. I know, Marina said gently. I figured it out about 2 weeks ago when I was doing research. You're Richard Hastings. You own 14 companies, including Caliber Tech Solutions. Richard sat back in his chair, looking physically staggered. The executive you reported? Was his name David Merchant? Yes. He's still there. He's vice president now. Richard's hands clenched into fists on the table. And you were destroyed for trying to do the right thing by a company I own. You didn't know, Marina said. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. You're not responsible for decisions made by managers you've never met. I'm responsible for the culture that allowed those decisions, Richard said sharply. I'm responsible for not implementing systems to protect people like you. I'm responsible for assuming that my executives were operating ethically without verifying it. He looked at her with anguish in his eyes. God, Marina. The woman I found crying on that street corner. That was my company's fault. Partly, Marina agreed. But it was also a larger systemic failure. The legal system that makes it almost impossible to prove retaliation. The professional networks that quietly blacklist troublemakers. The social services that are so overwhelmed they can't help everyone. The public that sees homelessness as a personal failure rather than a systemic one. She leaned forward. Richard, I'm not telling you this because I want revenge, or compensation, or even an apology, though I imagine you're preparing one. Then why? He asked. Why tell me at all? Marina's expression became fierce, passionate. Because I want to change it. I want to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to others. I want to build systems that protect whistleblowers instead of destroying them. I want companies to face real consequences for retaliation. She stopped, overwhelmed by the intensity of her own feelings. I want to matter, she said finally. Not just to survive, but to create change. To turn what happened to me into something that helps others. And I can't do that alone. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd said. Finally, he spoke. What do you need from me? A platform, Marina said. A chance to speak publicly about what happened. Not just to me, but about the systems that allow it to happen. And then, she took a breath. Then I need resources to build something better. A program that actually works. That actually helps people rebuild. Led by people who've been through it themselves. A platform? Richard repeated slowly. You want to go public with this story? Knowing it will expose my company's failures? Knowing it could damage my reputation and my business interests? Yes, Marina said simply, because the alternative is continuing to let people fall through the cracks, continuing to let companies destroy lives without consequences, continuing to treat homelessness as an individual moral failing instead of a structural issue. Richard stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Marina waited, her heart pounding, wondering if she'd misjudged him completely, wondering if the man who'd stopped his car would be the same man who'd let her speak truth to power. Finally, Richard's expression shifted. Something hardened in his eyes. Not anger at her, but determination. Okay, he said. Let's do it. All of it. The platform, the resources, the program. But Marina, he met her gaze with absolute seriousness. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Full transparency. No covering up the failures. Mine or the company's. No protecting reputations at the expense of truth. Can you handle that level of exposure? Can you? Marina countered. He smiled, a grim, determined expression. I guess we're both about to find out. The event was scheduled for 3 months later, giving them time to prepare carefully. Not just Marina's story, but a comprehensive presentation about systemic failures in corporate ethics, whistleblower protection, and the pipeline from employment to homelessness. Richard didn't try to control Marina's narrative or soften her message. Instead, he provided resources, a legal team to review everything for accuracy, a media consultant to help her present effectively, a therapist to help her process the trauma of revisiting everything publicly. He also launched an internal investigation at Caliber Tech Solutions. What they uncovered was worse than even Marina had suspected. A culture of retaliation that had destroyed not just her career, but several others, all buried under legal agreements and carefully crafted paper trails. David Merchant was fired. So were 3 other executives who'd participated in the cover-up. The legal team who'd constructed the false performance reviews were put on leave pending ethics investigations. Richard didn't announce these changes publicly. Not yet. He wanted Marina's presentation to come first, wanted her voice to be the one that defined the narrative. The night of the event arrived. The venue was packed. Industry leaders, journalists, company employees, activists, people from the community. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of genuine interest in reform. Still others looking for scandal. Marina stood backstage, dressed simply but professionally, reviewing her notes one final time. Her hands weren't shaking. She felt calm, centered, ready. Richard found her before she went on. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "Even now. If you've changed your mind, we can—" "I haven't changed my mind," Marina interrupted. "This matters. People need to hear it." He nodded, then surprised her by pulling her into a brief, firm hug. "You're one of the bravest people I've ever met," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Then Marina walked onto the stage. The presentation began not with her words, but with images on the large screen behind her. Photos from her time on the streets. Some she'd kept on an old phone, others taken by Richard or by activists who worked with the homeless population. Her face, gaunt and desperate. Her corner, with its plastic cup and cardboard sign. The expressions of people passing by, disgust, indifference, active avoidance. The room went absolutely silent. 3 months ago, Marina began, her voice steady and clear, I was crying on a street corner. Not because of hunger, though I was hungry. Not because of cold, though I was cold. I was crying because I had ceased to exist as a human being in the eyes of the world around me. She told her story. Not quickly, not defensively, but with measured precision. The successful career, the ethical violation she'd discovered, the careful systematic destruction that followed, the descent into homelessness, the months of invisibility. I could make this a story about personal resilience, Marina said, about how I survived through strength and determination. That would be comfortable for everyone. It would let you leave here feeling inspired without feeling implicated. She paused, letting that sink in. But that's not the truth. The truth is that I shouldn't have had to survive what I survived. The truth is that the systems that destroyed me are still in place, still destroying others. The truth is that every single person in this room, including me in my former life, participates in systems that make people invisible. The presentation continued, laying out in stark detail the failures at Caliber Tech Solutions, the legal loopholes that enable corporate retaliation, the inadequacies of social services, the cultural narratives that blame individuals for systemic failures. Marina pulled no punches. She named names, cited documents, showed evidence, but she also took care to show the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one company or one industry, but about larger structural issues that enabled this kind of harm. When she finished speaking, the room remained silent for several heartbeats. Then Richard stood from his seat in the front row. This woman, he said, his voice carrying across the space, is not a symbol of personal redemption. She's not here to make us feel good about helping the less fortunate. She's a mirror. And many people in this room, including me, are not going to like what we see when we look into it. He turned to face the audience directly. I own Caliber Tech Solutions, the company that destroyed Marina's life and the lives of others who tried to do the right thing. I didn't know about these specific cases, but that's not an excuse. It's evidence of my failure to create accountability. These things happened on my watch, in companies bearing my name, and I am responsible for that failure. The room erupted in whispers, shocked murmurs. Effective immediately, Richard continued. Caliber Tech Solutions is implementing comprehensive whistleblower protections. Every report of ethical violations will be investigated by an independent third party. Every employee who reports in good faith will be protected from retaliation, not just legally, but structurally. We're also establishing a fund to compensate individuals who were harmed by our past failures in this area. He gestured to Marina. But this isn't about one company making changes to improve its reputation. This is about fundamentally rethinking how we treat people who end up on the margins. To that end, I'm partnering with Marina to launch a new program. Not a charity, but a real system for helping people rebuild. Designed and led by people who've experienced homelessness themselves, because they're the experts. They're the ones who actually know what works. Marina stepped forward again. I was offered positions of power in Richard's companies as a result of exposing these issues, she said. Executive roles, high salaries, the kind of positions that would signal success and overcoming adversity. She paused, letting the audience imagine what those positions might have been. I declined all of them, Marina continued. Not because I'm not ambitious, and not because I don't think I could excel in those roles. I declined because accepting those positions would have made this about individual success, about one person escaping poverty while the systems that create poverty remain unchanged. She looked out at the audience, her gaze sweeping across the room. Instead, I'm building something different. A program that doesn't just provide temporary shelter or job training. A program that addresses the systemic issues that push people to the margins in the first place. That protects whistleblowers. That fights corporate retaliation. That provides real pathways back into housing and employment. And most importantly, that treats everyone involved as human beings with agency, dignity, and expertise. She brought up new slides showing the program's framework, comprehensive support services, legal advocacy, job placement with partner companies committed to reform, housing-first approaches, mental health care, and crucially, leadership roles for people with lived experience of homelessness. This isn't about charity, Marina emphasized. This isn't about wealthy people feeling good about helping the poor. This is about justice, about accountability, about changing the rules that allow companies to destroy lives without consequences, about building systems that recognize human dignity instead of erasing it. The presentation concluded with a call to action, not for donations but for structural change, corporate accountability measures, whistleblower protections, housing policy reform, a complete rethinking of how society addresses homelessness. When Marina finished and the lights came up, the room exploded, not with applause, though there was some, but with intense, heated discussion. Some people were clearly angry, defensive. Others were moved, engaged. Still others looked uncomfortable, confronted with truths they'd preferred to ignore. Richard joined Marina on stage for the Q&A session. The questions were tough, sometimes hostile. Journalists demanded specifics on the financial arrangements. Activists challenged whether any corporate-sponsored program could truly address systemic issues. Some of Richard's business associates questioned his decision to publicly expose his company's failures. Marina and Richard answered everything honestly, acknowledging limitations and uncertainties, refusing to oversimplify complex issues. One question came from a woman in the back. Marina, you say this isn't about personal redemption, but you've clearly been redeemed. You're off the streets. You're being given resources and platforms. How do you respond to accusations that you're exploiting your experience for personal gain? Marina's expression hardened. I respond by saying that framing is exactly the problem. The idea that anyone who speaks about systemic injustice must be either perfectly virtuous or secretly self-serving. The idea that I should remain grateful and quiet in exchange for being rescued. The idea that accepting help means giving up the right to demand justice. She leaned forward. Yes, I've been helped. Yes, I'm using platforms that most homeless people don't have access to. But I'm using those platforms to change the systems that hurt me and continue to hurt others. If that's exploitation, then our definition of exploitation is broken. The event continued late into the evening. By the time it ended, several major news outlets had already published stories. Social media was flooded with debate. Some praised Marina's courage and Richard's transparency. Others accused them of grandstanding, of orchestrating the whole thing for publicity. Marina didn't care about the critics. She cared about the calls that started coming in within hours, from other whistleblowers who'd been destroyed by corporate retaliation, from homeless individuals and advocacy organizations, from companies genuinely interested in reform, from legislators wanting to discuss whistleblower protection laws. The work was just beginning. 6 months later, Marina stood in the modest office space that housed the program's headquarters. The walls were covered with photos, not inspirational posters or corporate branding, but photographs taken by program participants. Images of dignity, of struggle, of community, of rebuilding. The program had started small, but was growing rapidly. 12 people in the first cohort, all formerly homeless, all receiving comprehensive support, while also serving as program designers and leaders. They were the ones making decisions about how services were structured, what kind of support was most useful, how to maintain dignity while accepting help. Richard stopped by regularly, but always in a supporting role. He provided funding and connections, opened doors and made introductions, but the program belonged to Marina and her team. "How's it going?" he asked during one visit, looking around at the bustling office. "Hard," Marina admitted. "Exhausting. We're learning that systems change is even more complicated than we thought. But also," she gestured at the activity around them, "people working together, planning, creating, building something new. Also worth it. Absolutely worth it." One of the program participants approached. James, a former engineer who'd lost everything after medical bankruptcy, and was now helping design the program's technology platforms. "Marina, the city council wants to meet about the housing policy proposal," he said. "They're actually interested in the housing first model we developed." "Schedule it," Marina said, "and make sure at least 3 participants are in that meeting. Their voices need to be heard directly, not filtered through me." James nodded and moved away. Richard smiled. "You're good at this." "I'm learning," Marina corrected. "We're all learning together. That's the point. We don't have all the answers, but we're figuring it out from lived experience instead of from abstract theory." Later that evening, Marina returned to her apartment. No longer the studio Richard had initially arranged, but a place she paid for herself with salary from the program. She made dinner, listened to music, read a book. Normal things, human things. But she didn't forget where she'd been. Couldn't forget. Wouldn't forget. Once a month, she walked past the corner where Richard had found her. Not out of nostalgia or morbid fascination, but as a reminder. A check against complacency. A way to stay connected to the urgency of the work. On one such walk, she saw a young woman sitting on that same corner. Skinny, dirty, crying quietly while people streamed past without seeing her. Marina stopped. "Hey," she said gently, crouching down to eye level. "What's your name?" The woman looked up, shocked that someone had actually acknowledged her. "Sarah," she whispered. "I'm Marina," she said, "and I understand. More than you might think. Are you hungry? Can I buy you something to eat?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the same tears Marina had cried. Tears that came from being recognized, from being treated as human. "Yes," Sarah said. "Please." As they walked to a nearby restaurant together, Sarah asked hesitantly, "Why are you helping me?" Marina thought about all the ways she could answer that question, about obligation and responsibility and social justice, about her program and its mission, about changing systems and building better worlds. But what she said was simply this: "Because someone stopped for me once, and because you matter. You exist. You're human. And that's enough." They sat down to eat, and Marina began to explain the program, the resources available, the possibility of something different. Sarah listened with the desperate hope of someone being offered a lifeline. Around them, the restaurant continued its normal rhythm. People eating, talking, living their lives. Not everyone noticed the 2 women in the corner, one clearly homeless and one clearly not, engaged in intense conversation over coffee and sandwiches. But some did notice. Some watched and wondered. Some remembered a story they'd heard about a homeless woman and a businessman and a moment of unexpected humanity that had sparked something larger. And somewhere in the city, in offices and shelters and policy meetings, the work continued. The hard, slow, crucial work of changing systems, of building something better, of insisting that every person has value, deserves dignity, matters. The world didn't change overnight. It never does. But it changed. Bit by bit, person by person, system by system. And this time, when change came, it came not from the top down, but from the margins inward, led by people who knew what it meant to be invisible and refused to accept that invisibility for anyone else. The rules were changing. And for the first time in a long time, no one dared to laugh. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe for more.